I originally intended to spend a little more time talking about the idea that prayers are not spells, and we'll get there, but a couple of comments made me want to double click on something first. Because one commenter wrote, God's divine plan may include our experience of good and evil, but what he is doing is beyond my suffering. And another person said, so God is literally massacring innocents by the thousands, on the most recent Q&A posted earlier today. And I think those two comments reveal something important. And it's interesting because one kind of answers the other. But whenever something terrible happens, we immediately ask, where was God? But whenever something beautiful happens, we rarely consider, was that God? We blame God for the darkness, but we rarely credit him for the light. And that's where I think this conversation gets interesting, because if someone wants to argue that God is responsible for both the good and the bad, that's actually a discussion we can have. God's people have wrestled with questions of suffering, justice, freedom, responsibility, and divine sovereignty for thousands of years. But if someone wants to blame God for every evil while refusing to credit him for any good, that isn't really a coherent position. It's applying two different standards, one for suffering and another for blessing. Because James says every good and perfect gift comes from above. So if God gets blamed for every tragedy, does he also get credit for every act of love, every kindness, every healing, every beautiful thing, every moment of grace, sunrise, answered prayer, every good and perfect gift? Because if not, we're not really following the argument to its conclusion. We're selectively applying it. Now, if someone does say, yes, God is responsible for both, then we've entered a different discussion. And that's where distinctions like God's infinite perfect will and permissive will become important, because Christianity, and before Christianity, the people of Israel have long wrestled with the difference between what God desires and what God allows. God allowing something is not necessarily the same thing as God delighting in it. And that's a conversation believers have debated for centuries. But I think part of the difficulty may be that we often imagine God as though he were simply a larger version of ourselves. That's what the other commenter was saying. A wiser human, a stronger human, a more powerful human. But Christianity doesn't claim God as a human being with more horsepower. It claims he is infinite, eternal, the creator rather than the creation. And that means there may always be limits to what finite minds can comprehend. As Isaiah says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. None of that eliminates suffering, and none of that magically answers every question. The existence of pain is real. The existence of evil is real. The existence of tragedy is real. But before we conclude that because we cannot see a purpose, no purpose exists, or because we cannot see justice, justice does not exist, it may be worth remembering the possibility that our perspective is not the whole picture. As Paul says in Corinthians, for now we see through a glass dimly. And perhaps that's where humility begins. Not in pretending we have all the answers, but in recognizing that finite creatures may not fully comprehend the infinite. I don't know. Next time, we'll come back to the question I originally intended to explore. If prayer isn't a spell, then what is it? Are they just weaponized wishful thinking? We'll see about that.